Okay. Professor Vladimir Bortun, thank you so very much for joining our interview series. Let me start right away with the first question. Given Simion's stronger than expected first round lead and his continued appeal despite being defeated in the runoff, how would you theorize the durability of far-right populism in Romania beyond the electoral cycle? Can this be conceptualized within a broader post-crisis populist consolidation rather than a mere reactionary surge?
Very, very important question. First of all, thank you again for the invitation. I'm not a professor just yet, just a lecturer. But to go straight into the topic, I would say that here the academic literature has shed some light, important light recently, on the key driver across borders for the rise of the populist far right. And there are, of course, many factors at play, and we will delve into some of them. But the key driver that is present in every context is economic insecurity, which is rooted in decades of neoliberal globalization. And these conditions have only become ripe after the crisis that you've mentioned, the 2007-2008 crisis, which in Europe, as you know, took a particularly austerity-based character in the way the European institutions and the national establishments dealt with that crisis. And Romania makes no exception. And just to give you some basic facts about what the socio-economic situation is in Romania after 35 years of neoliberal capitalism and about 18 years since we joined the European Union, which had its clear benefits, but also it failed for many Romanians, including those who have voted for the far right, failed to live up to the promises that it had at the beginning. We have 45% of the population living in poverty or on the verge of poverty. This is the highest percentage in the European Union, almost half of the population. We have the highest or the second highest in-work poverty rate. We have the lowest or among the lowest shares of the GDP spent on healthcare, on education, on social protection. We have after Ireland, we have the lowest capacity for tax collection. We have some of the lowest taxes in the European Union. We have a 10% flat tax on income, which disproportionately affects workers, employees, because on top of that, they have to pay also social contributions, which used to be paid by the employers, but now they are paid by the employees from their wage, the contributions to healthcare, to pensions. But of course, this 10% flat tax benefits the wealthier in society. And we also have a 16% corporate tax, which is among the lowest in the European Union. And of course, these are ripe conditions for economic insecurity that, as I said, is a fertile ground for the rise of the far right. But it's not just the poorest in society that we should talk about. Economic insecurity can affect different social classes and different class fractions. And it particularly affects in Romania the petty bourgeoisie, the small and medium entrepreneurs who have been closing down their businesses at a higher and higher rate over the last few years, particularly since COVID. I think the pandemic was another crisis that we need to factor in when explaining the rise of the far right. And these small, medium entrepreneurs who are going bankrupt in their thousands are a core element of the social base of the far right.
Right. How would you situate the AUR's electoral messaging, particularly its nationalist, economically neoliberal synthesis, within the wider genealogy of post-2008 far-right formations in Europe? Is there a uniquely Romanian hybrid emerging, or does AUR largely mirror external templates?
I think there are some certain similarities with the broader profile of the European far right. And there is clearly this populist discourse they employ, which, as you know, is built on this dichotomy between the pure people and the corrupt elite. And the elite, as in other countries is portrayed as those who have sold out our country, who don't represent the interests of our country, but represent foreign interests, globalist interests, and of course other undesirable categories in society, like the LGBTQ community, immigrants from non-European countries, whom have started to come to Romania as well in recent years as cheap labor, and other usual suspects of the targeting of the far-right rhetoric. At the same time, there is an element of truth in relation to the domination of foreign interests in Romania. Foreign companies have a strong dominant position in key sectors of the economy, like the energy sector, manufacture, the auto industry in particular, banking sector, in a way where they make huge profits in Romania, which then they repatriate in their home countries rather than at least partly reinvest in the Romanian economy. And the foreign banks in particular are guilty of this kind of repatriation of the profits made in Romania. And this leads to a certain dissatisfaction that we could see in other countries as well. For example, in Poland, there is a very interesting study about the comprador bankers who played a key role in the rise to power of the Law and Justice Party that ruled in Poland, as you know, for about a decade. These comprador bankers were Polish managers of foreign banks' subsidiaries in Poland, who after a while they realized that those foreign banks are in Poland just to make profits, which then they take back to their countries without investing in the Polish economy, without, for example, giving affordable, advantageous loans to the Polish businesses. So they kind of rebelled against this and joined the national capitalist hegemonic project of the Law and Justice Party. So there is an element of what I would call the comprador professional managerial class that has served foreign capital in these peripheral countries from Central Eastern Europe, who is fighting back against this foreign capital domination in coalition with the domestic capitalist class, particularly those fractions of the domestic capitalist class that are trying to secure the sectors where they are still dominant, particularly in Romania in real estate and constructions and hospitality. This party that you mentioned, that Simion, who lost the elections, is the leader of, is very well funded by sections of this capitalist class. Again, constructions, real estate, and hospitality. They are trying to ring fence and secure their interests against foreign capital, but also they're trying to get some state power to serve their interests. And this project of the national bourgeoisie that is trying to get back some state power is a very regional feature across Central Eastern Europe. Hungary, Poland, and now Romania display this character. But I would say even beyond. Turkey, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Erdogan project has similar characteristics as far as I know. One distinctive feature about the Romanian case, because I try to outline some of the common features, but there is something distinctive about the Romanian far right. I would say two features, and maybe one of them we will focus on in the next questions. It's their particular appeal to the diaspora. Diaspora is a big chunk of their social bloc, and I will give more details maybe later why they've been so successful in the diaspora. But a second distinctive feature is their appeal to farmers. Romania has the highest share of the workforce that works in agriculture in the whole European Union. About 20%, between 18 and 20% of the total workforce is in agriculture. To give you an idea of how high this share is, think that the second country in this ranking in the European Union is Poland, with only 10% of the workforce. France, which has a strong agriculture, has 2.4% of the workforce in agriculture. So this is a huge sector, and many of the vast majority of these people who work in agriculture are subsistence farmers. They are small farmers who feel like they have nobody looking after their interests. The state is there just to overburden them with regulations and taxation. The state is looking just after the interests of big foreign corporations, and the far right is managing to build inroads in this significant social class in Romania.
Right. How do you interpret the apparent paradox between widespread socioeconomic grievances and the relative electoral failure of redistributive political platforms, particularly in the light of Social Democratic Party's strategic vacillation and policy convergence with the right?
Yeah, that's the key factor from a subjective perspective. I try to talk about the objective factors, but in terms of the subjective conditions, clearly the key factor that has facilitated the rise of the far right, not just in Romania, but across the region and beyond, is the lack of a credible left-wing political project. And the current left party, center left, which you've mentioned, the PSD, is left in name, but not in substance, not in policy. They actually have governed for the majority of these 35 years of neoliberal capitalism. More or less 20 years out of these 35 have seen PSD in government. So they have implemented some of the policies that I've mentioned earlier, responsible for the socio-economic conditions. The very minimal social concessions in terms of redistribution that they have implemented in government has been the increase of the minimum wage, which is still something better than nothing, but which is why they are still the most voted party in Romania, but it's hardly sufficient. Still, with all these repeated increases in the minimum wage over the past 6-7 years, it's still very low. The minimum wage is about 30% less than what the living wage should be in Romania, right? The living wage that covers a decent living, the wage that you need for a decent living in Romania. The minimum wage is 30% less. And on top of that, we have the highest share of the workforce on minimum wage. So we have double the EU average of the workforce that works on minimum wage. Almost 40% of the whole workforce is on minimum wage. So we are a minimum wage economy and a low taxation economy and a low public spending economy. We are pretty much a neoliberal paradigmatic case study. And PSD is very much responsible for this. It's arguably the single most responsible political party for this situation.
Right. With over 60% of the diaspora backing Simion in the first round, what implications does this have for the dominant narratives that have historically cast diasporic Romanians as liberalizing or pro-European agents?
That's a significant shift indeed, and it started already in 2020 when the party AUR, which by the way stands for the Alliance for the Union of Romanians, but the acronym AUR also means gold in Romania. And from the very beginning, the party targeted its message towards the diaspora. They even called the diaspora, they called it the gold of Romania that we want to bring back to the country. The party was launched in the diaspora in 2019, in December 2019, 1 year before the first elections when they stood candidates. Their launch meeting was in Britain, among the Romanians living in the UK, not in Romania. So from the beginning, they had this orientation towards the diaspora. And I think they managed to appeal to the diaspora in several ways. On the one hand, this diaspora is not one diaspora, it's several diasporas. We are talking about 5 million people, which is a quarter of the total population of Romania. and they live pretty different lives in the west of Europe. Some of them live in pretty squalid conditions. They work very hard jobs on low wages, in poor conditions, with little respect, little feeling of being treated as equal. There is a widespread feeling that Romanians are treated as second-rate citizens, second-hand citizens, second-class citizens, sorry. Many of them are temporary or circular migrants, so they come, they work on a construction site for 3 months, 4 months, then they go back to Romania, or they go during the season to pick up vegetables on the farms of Italy or Spain or Britain or Germany, and then they go back. So they don't have a context favorable for their integration, for their socialization in the host countries. But those host countries themselves, let's be honest, they've experienced the surge of the far right. So the far right is much more mainstream now in these Western countries than it used to be 10, 15, 20 years ago, when these migrants were indeed sending back more liberal kind of remittances, right? Social remittances. Those societies have changed and have shifted very much to the right. The anti-immigration discourses have become more mainstream, more normalized, more legitimized, and Romanians living there have internalized some of the discourse. And I often, in my own fieldwork, I often came across people who, despite being migrants themselves, despite suffering from anti-migration immigration attitudes and discourse, they were themselves against other groups of migrants, distinguishing themselves from them, talking about good migrants and bad migrants. So there is a real cognitive dissonance at play here, where migrants adopt anti-migration attitudes and political partisan preferences. Another aspect here is that they feel that Romania is a peripheral country that doesn't have a real voice in the European Union and in the broader global political stage. They feel that Romania is subordinated economically and geopolitically, which is true. So when a populist demagogue like Simion comes and says, I will make Romania stand tall again in the European Union and in the world, they feel some sense of dignity restored, some sense of restored pride. Whereas all the other political parties, including the PSD, are utterly uncritical in their allegiance to the European Union and to NATO and the West in general and so on. They are refusing to acknowledge these problems that are facing Romanians, both in terms of their living conditions in the diaspora, but also in terms of how Romania is located in the international structures of power. Talking entirely about the benefits and the advantages of being inside these structures without acknowledging the problems and the challenges and the contradictions of Romania's location in the European and international economic and political system. And this obviously opens the window of opportunity for the far right to come and capitalize on people's sense of marginalization, humiliation, and so on and so forth. But one additional point I would like to make, sorry for going on so long on this question, but I think it's important to underline that many of these migrants, as I said, are circular migrants, temporary migrants, and they may be working blue-collar jobs abroad, but they have accumulated enough capital to open a little business at home in their town or their village of origin, which means that they are in a complex dual class location. Proletarians abroad, petty bourgeois at home. And when they come home, after they have worked so hard abroad to accumulate this capital that allowed them to open a small guest house or a small cafe or a restaurant or a shop on the corner, they feel that the state doesn't do anything for them. It overburdens them with taxation. The increases in the minimum wage is perceived as a burden on them because they are small employers that have to pay 2, 3, 4 wages. And they are blaming the state, but also they are blaming those below them, those on minimum wage that they have to pay, or those on on welfare benefits who not work. They blame them for being lazy, for asking for too much, when they are the real hard working people who have sacrificed so much to make some money abroad so they can invest in the Romanian economy. And here they are, abandoned by the state that should protect their interests. And I think this is very important and very I'm not saying it's unique to the Romanian case, but it's very salient. And maybe it's not such a salient feature for the far right and the social base of the far right in other European countries.
Right. Building on your work on transnational political mobilization, how should we understand the AUR's success among immigrants in Italy and Spain? Do these cases indicate a diasporic production of illiberal subjectivities shaped by specific host country political contexts?
Yeah, for sure. I think I covered this already in my previous answer, but Italy and Spain are particularly prone to some of the realities that I tried to sketch earlier, especially in Italy, where you have a far-right for the last 2.5 years. So there, the migrants are in a race to the bottom to prove themselves as worthier than the other migrants. And I encountered many instances of Romanian migrants in Italy or former migrants, returned migrants who had lived in Italy many years, who were very negative towards Moroccan migrants, for example, or Albanian migrants. And they even told me that they used to vote for the Northern League, which is called now La Lega, Salvini's party, the original far-right populist party before Brothers of Italy became more successful than them. They were voting for this party that had some very anti-Romanian statements in the Italian press. And nevertheless, it was their way of trying to carve a place for them by finding somebody below them that they could punch as the bad migrant. So in Spain, we see a similar surge with the Vox party in the last few years that is now the third political force of Spain in a country where the far right was outside of the parliament for decades. And again, we are talking about a Romanian diaspora that has suffered a lot of discrimination and a lot of marginalization in Spain that took a long time for it to settle. But there is a split as well in these diasporas, as I mentioned, between this more settled, integrated diaspora and this kind of precariously employed, circular, temporary migrants who come and go and who cannot really find a foothold in these countries.
Right. Comparing Romania's recent presidential runoff to parallel dynamics in Poland and Portugal, to what extent can we speak of converging or diverging trajectories in the European center-right strategy to contain or accommodate far-right surges?
I think we see a very strong trend of accommodation of the far right, and not just from the center right, also from the center left. In Denmark, for example, I'm going a bit outside of the region, but in Denmark, the Social Democratic Party there, which is in government, has adopted a very harsh anti-immigration policy, one of the harshest in Europe, and it's little talked about. Even in the UK here, the Starmer government has adopted many of the talking points, not just of the Conservative Party, but of Reform UK. Starmer talking the other day about Britain being a country of strangers, an island of strangers because of mass migration, according to him. So I'm a stranger here, apparently. So there is a lot of what has been called in the literature by people like Aurélien Mondon and Aaron Winter, mainstreaming of the far right, the mainstreaming of reactionary ideas and policies, not just ideas, not just rhetoric, actual policy making that both center-right and center-left parties have adopted in an attempt to capture back some of the voters that they lost to the far right. But as they say, the original is better than the copy. So people who want to vote for the far right for these reactionary reasons, because they are against immigration, they won't suddenly switch to the center left just because the center left is adopting these tropes, these anti-immigration tropes. They will keep voting for the far right, and we have seen this across the board. The one social democratic party in power in Western Europe, in the European Union at least, in Spain, he has resisted this temptation from going in this reactionary direction on issues like anti-immigration and other similar topics that are very dear to the far right. On the contrary, they have been in some ways an example of what a progressive government should say on key issues of our time, including the atrocities that we see happening in Gaza. So they are, if you want, they are not a perfect government. They have many flaws and many shortcomings, but nevertheless, they show that you can stay true to the social democratic values and policies and still win elections. This is just purely from a pragmatic point of view.
Right. What insights might Romania's 2025 election offer for understanding the evolving relationship between anti-corruption discourse and far-right populism, especially contrasted with the case of Poland's Law and Justice or France's National Rally?
And that's a very interesting question. And I think on the one hand, their collusion with corrupt practices and clientelist practices shows that, after all, the far right is not such an alternative to the mainstream parties that they are criticizing. They are happy to engage in the same kind of bad politics that the mainstream parties are guilty of. On the other hand, I think while corruption is a big problem in a country like Romania, but also in other countries, it's often framed in a very legalistic way, almost a moralistic way. It's a flaw of character, or it's because of the state bureaucracy. So on the one hand, it is used in an ideological way to justify the further shrinking of the state, to justify further public spending cuts. Because, for example, there is a lot of corruption in the benefit system, despite the fact that Romania has the lowest percentage of the GDP allocated to the welfare system in the whole European Union. But nevertheless, this kind of mantra is very salient in the public discourse. So the anti-corruption discourse has been instrumentalized ideologically to justify very harsh austerity and neoliberal measures. But at the same time, it stays at when there is something done against corruption by putting some corrupt politicians in prison, it stops at this kind of legalistic surface, which is not helping against the far right. We saw for the democratic establishment in the United States trying to go after Trump from a legal point of view for 4 years, and Trump still won the elections, right? Le Pen has been barred from standing in the elections, and her party is, I think, is growing in polls. It's not going down, that's for sure. It's not going down in polls. It's not cutting the wind out of the sails of the far right. In Romania, the Constitutional Court, as you know, canceled the elections in November and barred the candidate that won them, Georgescu. And the guy who took his place, Simion, got double the percentage in the first round. It didn't work. So I'm not saying it shouldn't have been done, because if there is a legal argument for it, then by all means do it. But this is not a solution to tackle the far right. And about corruption, to make an important point, beyond the instrumentalization of this real issue that should be tackled, but it has been instrumentalized in this ideological way to justify neoliberal measures, but also it is often decontextualized, in the sense that corruption needs to be understood as a key vehicle for the primitive accumulation of capital, which is characteristic of any initial stage in the development of capitalism in any country in the world, in any period of history. Corruption and more violent forms of capital accumulation have always been present in all countries, even in the so-called advanced consolidated democracies that have had capitalism for a longer period of time. Corruption played a massive role in the emergence of capitalism, and corruption still plays today a key role in the accumulation of capital. After all, the dirty money of drug cartels and crime syndicates and dictators around the world are, much of it, washed through the city of London, the capital of global capital in many ways. So if we are to tackle corruption, we need to go to the root of the problem and see it as part of a broader structural systemic issue.
Right. And lastly, from a historical comparative perspective, how does the then Simion runoff recalibrate the ideological field established in the 1990s transition era? Are we witnessing a definitive exhaustion of post-1989 liberal centrism, or it's a tactical reanimation?
This is a great question. And you know, there were these rumors about the death of the neoliberal center several times in the past 15 years. After the financial crisis, there were rumors about the death of neoliberalism, that there will be a return to some more Keynesian type of economic model. It didn't happen. We had more neoliberalism, more austerity, more privatizations, more deregulation, more flexibilization of the workforce. Then again, there were rumors about the death of neoliberalism after the COVID pandemic, when the state intervened in a forceful way to keep societies afloat, actually to keep the accumulation of capital going. Again, it was temporary. Neoliberalism has come back in full force. Again, we see now with the militarization of Europe, we see promises of spending cuts on the most important services in society in order to fund the militarization efforts. So I'm afraid that we are not seeing an end to neoliberal centrism, but its transformation into something more authoritarian, but still neoliberal. A shift from, if you want, democratic neoliberalism into authoritarian neoliberalism, endorsed both by the center, which is adopting authoritarian measures everywhere around Europe. Here in the UK, the so-called center-left government has put people in prison because of holding a Zoom meeting to block a motorway in protest against the destruction of the environment. So not even putting them in prison for blocking the motorway, just talking about blocking a motorway as a form of civil disobedience against climate catastrophe. So we see this shift towards authoritarianism. And when it comes to the economic agenda, we see a very strong overlap between these centrist parties and the far right that claims to be an alternative to the status quo, is capitalizing on the grievances and the socio-economic anxiety and insecurity of ordinary people. But if we look at their actual policy proposals, or where they are empowered, their actual policy making is more of the same. They might throw a few crumbles to the ordinary people, to the popular classes, to keep them in place, but the majority of their economic agenda is still in the service of the business class and the wealthy in society, just different factions of the business class and the wealthy than the centrist parties tend to represent.
Right. Dr. Vladimir Bortun, thank you so very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you too. Very, very interesting questions, very stimulating. I appreciate it. Thank you.